If there is one game that comes to mind whenever I hear the term point-and-click adventure game, it would have to be the
Day of the Tentacle.
Well, yeah, it's a great game, but it's not exactly what I had in mind.
I see. So you were thinking of Grim Fandango. Great choice. I think it may be the greatest...
No, I meant the secret
Siberia.
Would you let me finish?
Longest Journey? Broken Sword. It's Broken Sword, isn't it? Okay, I'm just teasing. What was it? Oh, come on, don't be upset.
Alright then, let's try the steak again, I guess. If there is one game that comes to mind whenever I hear the term point-and-click adventure game, it would have to be the
Quest for Glory 4.
I'm done.
What can be said about Monkey Island? Quite a lot actually, so before we begin, let's quickly get the developers out of the way, and we need to be quick because, oh man, do we have a lot to cover here. The secret of Monkey Island's development was led by 3 people. The leader of the project was the veteran developer Ron Gilbert, the creator of the now legendary SCUM engine that, in addition to being used in every LucasArts adventure game that came after, can be cited as the main reason for the outstanding success of LucasArts as a game company. The team also consisted of 2 newcomers, Tim Schafer, whose later contributions, among many things, include the creation of a video game equivalent of Casablanca, and probably the least famous of the 3, Dave Grossman, a man who not only played a part in the growth of the now famous Telltale games, but was also at the helm in the development of the greatest children's adventure game ever made. So, seeing as a guy with such an outstanding credit is the least notable name on the team, you can only imagine the artistic potential that's been condensed within this project, and the result of their collective work is now regarded as one of the most important games in history, which not only defined adventure games but made LucasArts into possibly the most prominent computer game developer of the decade. Just what sort of game did they make back then to have such an impact? Well, let's find out. The secret of Monkey Island is... that's going to take forever if we keep calling it like that. From now on, let's call it SoMI. SoMI is the definitive example of a point-and-click adventure game, meaning that the core gameplay revolves around navigating various rooms, or screens as I like to call them, in search of items, so that when you find a puzzle that obstructs your path, you could use one of those items to remove that obstruction, thus continuing the progress. The trick is, you never know which item is needed for the puzzle at hand. In fact, in figuring out which item goes in which puzzle lies the challenge of this gameplay. Well, half of it at least. The other half is in finding those items, which often turns into a rather tricky ordeal referred to as pixel hunting.
What I've described so far may not sound like it, but this results in one of the most challenging and difficult to the point of aggravation gameplays ever devised by man.
You see, the way with which the player is supposed to figure out which item to use on which puzzle is logic. The key word here is supposed, because you see, if you make it too logical, you remove the challenge from a game. For example, if the player has to use a key on a locked door, even though from a mechanical standpoint it would qualify as a puzzle, there would be no thinking involved in solving it, as if the player got through it on autopilot. If this was the extent of the puzzles in a game, it would lose any point as a gameplay mechanic. The game might as well not have any puzzles to begin with. To make the puzzles properly interesting, you need to somehow make the player think, and to do so you need to make puzzles a bit cryptic. And here lies the problem.
Different people think differently, so what may sound just a little unclear for the developer may be ridiculously cryptic for the player. Especially considering that he has to figure out those puzzles through the medium of video game interface.
The reason I brought up the interface was because, paradoxically, the more you play those adventure games, the easier it becomes to solve their puzzles. It's actually a bit weird how it works. I mean, when I first played Broken Sword, for instance, I remember being stuck for the longest time on a puzzle which involved using a manhole opener on a manhole. That didn't sound right at all.
The point is, it's almost impossible to not just design balanced puzzles that would be neither too difficult nor too easy for every player, but also to criticize them, because their difficulty will most certainly vary from person to person on pretty much random basis.
But there are certain things that can be more easily pinned down. As you can see, you have 9 different actions to choose from, which is of course a legacy of adventure games like King's Quest, which relied upon verbs as your means of interactions with the game. This is actually a fascinating thing to observe, how over time adventure games gave less and less actions to the player as they slowly realize that they don't require them anymore, until they eventually settle down with having only 2, use and look, a control scheme best suited for point-and-click gameplay. Things are not so black and white, however, as in having less words you narrow down the list of options at the player's disposal. Now instead of having 9 possible things to do with an item, you have only 2. Even 1 in some instances. Seeing as having numerous options to try out is a part of the challenge in adventure games, developers often have to overcompensate for such ease-ups on the player. They will make their puzzles even more cryptic, they will throw tons of items at the player, or they will make up another contrived way of complicating the control scheme. I mean, there is a place for numerous actions in a point-and-click game, as they add another layer to puzzle solving. The player not only has to choose an item, but how he'll use it, and the more options he has, the less tempted he will be to just try everything on everything, and instead he'll actually try and choose which options are more likely to work in a given situation.
What results is a natural way of ensuring that the player will play the game as it was intended, without having to needlessly overcomplicate matters, right?
To answer this question, let me show you an actual puzzle from the game. You are supposed to get by this swarm of piranha-like poodles by feeding them a piece of meat. But not any meat, you have to previously cook the meat and then put the poisonous condiment on it. But what is this condiment, you might ask? Well, it's this random flower. No, not that one. It's a flower that you pick in a forest maze, and how are you supposed to know that this is the condiment you are looking for? In fact, how would you even know to pick up some random flower in a seemingly randomly generated forest without any hints?
There were hints actually.
Wait, what do you mean? Where?
The prisoner tells you about it.
Well, I'll be damned. I completely missed that. But still, just by simply hearing that this flower is illegal, you're supposed to presume that this is a poisonous flower. Not only that you should use it as a condiment on a piece of meat, that you then should feed to the dogs that guard the mansion. If you ask me, this is a bit of a leap.
But you know, not every puzzle is like that in SoMI. Some are rather easy and some are even more difficult, and which puzzles are going to be which is not going to be the same for everybody. Whether you'll solve a puzzle or get stuck on it is, bottom line, a matter of random chance. The only way for the developers to ensure that no one gets stuck would be by making the puzzles as easy as to not even qualify as mental challenges. but then there would be no joy of victory, of overcoming something. You had a very real possibility of failing at. That is exactly what makes the satisfaction of puzzle solving real, this tangible possibility of losing. You know, there is this moment when, after spending what seems like forever on a puzzle, when your frustration and anger reach their absolute limit, and then you suddenly defeat this aggravating puzzle. The feeling of satisfaction you get at this very moment is almost incomparable to games of other genres. And this feeling gets stronger the more aggravation you've accumulated up to this moment of revelation, making it seem like all the frustration you were feeling was just fertilizer for the joyous feeling of victory.
This is the appeal of puzzle solving, the heights of those emotions, both positive and negative, and how they reinforce one another. The realness of obstacles and how they can actually defeat you. Not with a game over screen that merely gives you another chance, but by actually forcing you to admit defeat and look up solutions online.
I don't know if I have to point this one out, but you obviously shouldn't take defeat personally. As I've described before, these adventure game puzzles disregard common sense to become cryptic for every potential player. It really doesn't matter how smart you are in real life, just look. Here, to get the item, you have to make Guybrush step on this particular spot on the screen that is not even highlighted in any manner, which is a gimmick that is never even used or established anywhere outside of this puzzle. And I challenge you to explain to me how this is in any way logical. And more importantly, how being able to solve this puzzle is a sign of intelligence. It's literally a matter of chance. You might occasionally stumble upon a correct solution, or you might not. It's a total gamble. And what you're gambling with is your feelings. I rarely feel as frustrated and angry in a game as when I get stuck on a seemingly unsolvable puzzle. And I rarely feel as much satisfaction in games as I do when I manage to solve a puzzle that's been troubling me for minutes, sometimes even hours. And I rarely feel as defeated as when I have to look up a solution online, which I did for this puzzle actually. But hey, it only made me try twice as hard on the next puzzle I found, which in turn made the victory over it that much sweeter.
So I don't know, it's obviously not a gameplay for everybody, especially if you're looking for a relaxed, consistently pleasant experience. In fact, I would without a question say that puzzle solving is by far the most hardcore gameplay I've ever experienced in any single player genre. But I love it.
I love the challenge and the fact of how emotionally provocative this gameplay becomes. I don't mind becoming frustrated, especially when this frustration can turn into a defined sense of self-satisfaction when I stumble across a solution. This gameplay is basically a roller coaster of emotions, but I would be lying if this was the only reason why adventure games are one of my favorite genres, because you see, in SoMI, your motivation and the reward for solving those puzzles are dialogues. It's no secret that dialogues are the main reason why people even play LucasArts adventure games, and SoMI is no exception. Dialogues are excellent in this, and don't let the simple vocabulary of those lines fool you. The amount of wit and genuine sarcastic humor exhibited in SoMI remains unmatched to this very day, if you ask me. And if you're wondering, yes, every single proper name is trademarked in this. It's not just a one-time gag. But it's not just writing that makes those dialogues. This is a dialogue tree. The fundament of interactive storytelling and the core reason why so many people, including me, adore dialogues in video games.
I simply can't stress the value and ingenuity of dialogue trees enough. They not only turn dialogues from being basically cutscenes that you watch into an actual active part of gameplay, but they also bring player agency into storytelling.
And yes, I'm perfectly aware that this tree doesn't even remotely resemble a real conversation. You literally just have a selection of lines, and you choose the one that appeals to you the most. By the way, what is the trademarked secret of Monkey Island? I really like that line for some reason. You could say that it's not so much about you yourself being the protagonist of a story as it is about you having control over the protagonist. Every possible line is his and his alone. You could even say they're his thoughts, but which one he will go with is up to you. That analogy is even more relevant in SoMI than you may think, since in this game you often have lines that are similar, but one will be much more reactionary than the other one. It's because what you are really reading right now are the thoughts of Guybrush, the thoughts he may or may not express out loud. And you're basically his inner voice that says, "Hold your horses there, you can't say that." Or alternatively, the one encouraging him to say the most provocative and ridiculous statements he could come up with. Which is how I usually play LucasArts games, always going with the line I thought was the funniest. By the way, I have something to tell you that may be surprising. You see, there is something about the dialogues of SoMI that sets them apart from pretty much every other game with written dialogues. A certain thing which is almost unnoticeable on a pre-recorded video, but which has a profound effect on the gameplay experience. You see, if you thought that every time a line was skipped on screen, it was me pressing a button to skip it, you'd be wrong. Those lines were disappearing by themselves.
The implications of this design choice are rather harsh, since if the player doesn't read the line in allocated time, he will miss it, and with that he will presumably fail at following the conversation along.
Needless to say that this puts pressure on the player, as he is now forced to read the lines not at his own pace, but at the speed dictated by the game. To be honest, this description paints a much more dire picture than what we actually got in the game. There are numerous factors that are addressing this very issue, one of which involves the aforementioned dialogue tree. As every time dialogue options appear for you to choose, you get a pause in the flow of lines that you had to keep up with. A pause that allows you a calm moment to relax and collect your thoughts as you carefully read your options. Well, this is a weird thing to say in a pirate theme game, but anyway. What's important is that this arbitrary time is adjustable on the fly. In-game, you can make the auto-skip be so slow you'll basically have to press the button to skip to the next line. Although I wouldn't recommend it. For starters, after a while you get so accustomed to reading those lines that making them auto-skip is almost a matter of convenience. It's more enjoyable to simply adjust the speed and read along, and also there is a reason as to why the developers designed the game like this.
The idea here is that by making the dialogues timed, by introducing this element of pressure into them, they would stop feeling like static, written dialogues from books and instead gain an almost cinematic quality to them.
As you can tell, the pressure is minimized, but the mere fact of dialogues dictating their own pace, the mere possibility of missing a line is what's important here, as it inclines the player on an almost subconscious level to become twice as attentive and focused on reading and absorbing those dialogue lines. Wait a second, contact lenses? In the 18th century Caribbean? Alright. Because of this dynamic, timed quality, dialogues become inherently more involving and engaging, even without taking into account their writing. And since in LucasArts adventure games dialogues are king, you could see how the developers would want to keep the player's attention on dialogues as high as possible. I mean, just imagine how drastically different this game would be if the dialogues were changed to not be timed. It may seem like such a small detail, but to anyone familiar with this game, it would feel literally drained of energy and life.
George, I'd hate to interrupt you, but if the idea is to make a written dialogue more cinematic, don't you think that it would make much more sense to have them voice acted? That would make them dynamic and lively even without having to put unnecessary pressure on the player.
Well, that's precisely the point, Seal. It would make sense. In fact, the developers would have preferred to have voice acting in SoMI, but simply due to the technological limitations, it wasn't possible at the time.
You could say that this entire timed gimmick is basically a way to circumvent this limitation, to make dialogues feel as similar to movie dialogues as they can be with just text. I mean, you can tell that if they had an option, they would use real voice acting, because as soon as CDs became available, every single LucasArts adventure game dropped the SoMI's dialogue format. In fact, the only games to feature it were Indiana Jones titles, the SoMI's very own sequel, and the Brian Moriarty's Loom. And Loom was even re-released with voice acting.
Well, if you say so, George.
Oh, and speaking of Loom, you thought this was immersion ruining. Well, how about this fellow over here? Where do I even begin with this? When you ask him anything aside from the obvious question, he responds with a laconic "hi," which obviously implies that he is a simpleton, or maybe he's just drunk out of his mind. So let us try to ask him, huh? Now he talks at length with perfect eloquence on why you should go out and buy Loom in real life. This is so out of place in a Pirate Sim game, it feels like some sort of an Easter egg. I mean, King's Quest 2 did something similar, but it was hidden in the most obscure spot in the entire game. And here's this guy, on the other hand, who is not even hidden. He's sitting alongside characters that are actually there to progress the story, meaning that he is not only hard to miss, but he's also one of the very first things the players will see in this game. That's quite a way to make a first impression. If you try to call him out for being such an obvious sellout, he responds with what I can only describe as a lame excuse. I mean, did he come up with that on the spot or what? I don't know what to say about all this. We are only 15 minutes in and the fourth wall was broken so many times already, it's hard to keep track. Every person you meet says something out of character, every proper name is trademarked for some reason, and now this guy is just sitting there with his fake pirate beard telling you to buy a Loom of all things. There is no other way to put it. At this point, SoMI is literally a parody of itself. It's like no one takes their role seriously in this game. People mention contact lenses, use credits from stores, you can even have a conversation with some random dog, and even this dog breaks character. And this is not even the end of it. After the dog misspoke and accidentally said something it wasn't supposed to, you can then use the information you got from the dog to progress the plot. I'm not even joking. And by the way, during those moments that characters do take their roles seriously, their resulting performances can be described as anything other than phoned in, over-the-top acting. I mean, just look at this scene. It's cheesy as all hell, yet every time they say something fourth wall breaking or out of character, something unexpectedly bitter or sarcastic, the authenticity and genuine vibe you get from their lines is the exact opposite of the silliness of their lines in character. I mean, the only person that I recall that never breaks his role and manages to perform it rather convincingly is a character that doesn't even belong in the setting in the first place.
It's baffling to me. I honestly don't know how to describe it. It's like the entire game is staged and every character you meet is just trying to play his part in a silly pirate-themed theater play. But what's even more surprising is that this is not restricted to dialogues. Every other aspect of this game is struggling just as hard at maintaining a straight face.
Look at what happens when you solve the Piranha Poodles puzzle, for instance. A giant plague appears on screen in what may seem like a regular part of the UI, even though this is the one and only time in the entire game when such notice appears on screen. And it shows you completely unnecessary comment about how dogs are alive and well and that they're just sleeping. Just imagine if something like this happened in any other game. Your immersion would get completely shattered. It would be jarring to say the least. But here, stuff like this happens so often that this particular gag doesn't even feel all that shocking. Like, did you see the advertisement sign that was flashing during the conversation with the loom guy? It was the only time anything appeared in the bottom window other than dialogue options in the entire game, and it didn't even feel like that big of a deal.
SoMI takes every opportunity to play around with your expectations. It plays around with the UI, with the dialogue format, with the controls, and even its own gameplay conventions. In fact, just seeing all the interesting ways in which SoMI basically breaks itself became the most fascinating thing about this game for me. Wait, what's the next line? Yeah, I thought I forgot something. Oh well.
What do you mean, oh well? Can't you come up with something?
Oh, come on, Seal. I think we can just skip to the next part. It's not like that important.
It's been more than a year since your last video, George. The least I could hope for is a decent script.
You'll be fine, Seal, don't worry. We'll think of something in the editing.
But still, since each line disappears after a certain amount of time, regardless of how you customize it, there is a real risk that the player will miss it. He might get distracted with something, he might zone out, become lost in thoughts, whatever. There are tons of possible reasons, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal if not for the fact that if he happens to miss an important piece of information, he will, presumably, not be able to follow the conversation along. Hence, he will become uninvested in the most important aspect of this game.
So in short, it's a problem. And the way with which developers address this problem is... let me just show you.
This is the very first conversation. In fact, it's the very first scene in the entire game, and I think it illustrates better than anything the way with which the developers crafted their dialogues in SoMI. Right off the bat, notice how the first line is Guybrush's hi, which quickly gets replaced with the line of actual significance, the one that introduces both his name and his simple goal. This hi is there to immediately establish how the dialogue is timed, and that the player can't just leisurely read the lines at his own pace, he has to read them quickly before they disappear. If there was no highs there and the game just started off immediately with an important line, it wouldn't be nearly as elegant. The player wouldn't be prepared for its disappearance, so there would be a high chance of a rather awkward timing. But now, in 1 second, SoMI establishes the format at the expense of this useless line. The following lines, therefore, becomes the first and possibly only line in the entire game the player will focus 100% on absorbing. Everything else will be read on autopilot. So having it convey in such a straightforward manner both the name and the goal of the protagonist is perfect, as it uses this heightened focus of the player to make him absorb the only information he needs to take away from this exchange. What is even more important is how each thing of note, name of the character, his goal, where he should go and with whom to talk, gets repeated. For example, after the brief humorous exchange that basically serves as filler, the blind guy mispronounces the name of our protagonist, making him repeat it. And after that, the blind guy replies with, "So you wanna be a pirate, eh?" Thus repeating the second portion of the first expository statement. Now, I know that excessive repetition like this is typically a sign of a bad writing, but you need to keep in mind that what we are reading right now is not a book, because if we were, the lines wouldn't be disappearing from the pages like they do in this game, making it very possible to miss one and then lose track of the entire story. So what the developers did was try and lessen this possibility with several key techniques, one of which is this very repetition of important statements several times to make sure that the player will not miss them. This is a nice way of making conversations more easily enjoyable, as the possibility of missing stuff becomes lessened to the point of a non-issue, while the dialogue still retains the benefits of a heightened player's attention. Note, those repeats don't feel like repeats for idiots, but the opposite. Because of them you don't even notice anything weird about the dialogue format of this game. It feels flowing. Without them, if you just happen to miss some info, you would immediately realize how unforgiving and clunky this dialogue format is by default. This is what I mean when I say that this dialogue highlights the nuance of the SoMI's unique dialogue format. It begins with an inconsequential hi that introduces the player to the notion of timed dialogue, making sure that the second line, filled with plot significant information, will be read quickly by the player. Then it creates a little breathing room with several lines of filler, following up with a repeat of the first important piece of information that now gets extended to 4 lines. This ensures that the player has absolutely no difficulty getting all this information, even if he happens to miss some of those lines. It is all followed up with the joke lines that serves as another bit of breathing room for the player, and then there is a line that both repeats the goal of the character and establishes a new piece of information, that you need to talk to the pirate leaders.
You see how, just by structuring the conversation around repetition of important information and humorous filler, the dialogue now acquires a sense of pace and flow. But the developers didn't stop there.
The second technique they'll be using a lot is tying together previous and next important piece of info with bridge lines that allow for a smooth transition from topic to topic, while at the same time repeating them both to straighten the first technique. If they were to just jump without those bridges that repeat the prior point and allude to the next one, it would not just be harder to follow, but also less flowing, as this format of dialogue doesn't allow you to simply look up previous topics like a screenplay would. When constructing conversations here, you need to remember that you are not constructing a literal text, but maintaining a train of abstract ideas in the player's head. As soon as the line is gone, its text is no longer present, but the plot point established within it should remain in the player's mind. The best way to ensure that is to prolong its presence on screen through future lines, which is also a nice way of highlighting which topics are important and which are just comedic filler. A nice side bonus of those two techniques working together is that they also relieve the task of filtering out important bits of info from the player, since what is important will get repeated anyway, he now doesn't need to make any effort but just relax and simply enjoy the conversation. This nicely leads us to the third technique that works very well with the previous two, the usage of filler lines. The lines that are there simply to create some breathing room between important ones. Without them, you would have to intently read and remember everything. But now you can treat all lines with only half of your attention and not worry. The ones that matter will be repeated, so you'll remember them anyway. The ones that aren't repeated won't be remembered, but they're just filler. Notice that the time element in this format already heightens the player's attention to a remarkable level. What is tenser than having to speed read? So these ease-ups on the player do not in any way ruin it. They merely prevent the tension from getting noticeable, from becoming unpleasant.
These techniques sort of help to push this dynamic quality of dialogues into the fun direction, rather than making them even more unforgiving by only saying each important piece of information once, without any repeats, bridges or filler.
Because remember, it's not a book, it's a completely different sensibility, so abiding by literary techniques of how to weave dialogue is in fact harmful to the experience. It's not a manipulation of words, but a manipulation of players' attention and short-term memory through repetition, filler and transitional bridges. Which is why transitional lines are so important here, since only through them can you tie together those floating abstract topics of conversation. Although, just to be clear, even though repetition is beneficial to this dialogue format, devs knew not to overdo it. Look here, for instance, the blind guy doesn't say you'll find the pirate leaders in the scum bar. Instead he says, you'll find them in the scum bar, and you know who they are, because there was already enough words dedicated to them already.
The conversation already established a flow of topics on which it can now rely, which is why even when the player just misses a bunch of lines, he still sort of grasps the gist of the conversation. It's because in his head there is a connection of topics now. Talk to the pirate leaders to become a pirate.
And I mean, if you had doubts up to this point, then look at what happens next. After we get a bunch of filler as the conversation seems to end, Guybrush turns and asks again where to find the pirate leaders, a repeat of who to find. And Blind Man again repeats the name of the scum bar, a repeat of where. This tells you pretty much everything you need to know of how careful developers were in weaving those conversations. They not only repeated every piece of information 3 to 4 times during a 1-minute conversation, no, they were so extremely conscious of the flaws in this dialogue format, of the necessity of repetition and filler, that on top of all this, they add this little extra bit that highlights the most important information just in case.
This entire conversation lasts for about a minute, and in terms of structure and flow, it's one of the simplest ones in the entire game. But I feel like you can already tell just how much thought went into those conversations and making them as engaging as they could possibly be.
I mean, this is just text, but it feels dynamic. It's literally a bunch of disappearing lines, yet after the conversation ends, you don't feel like you were under any pressure. I feel that even after this analysis, you might still feel that there is no way there was so much depth to those conversations. And I wouldn't blame you. They feel effortless, natural to such a degree that the player is left thinking, of course that's how the timed written dialogue works. That's just its nature. But all you need to do to understand the masterful quality of SoMI's dialogues is to imagine how it would feel if they were making it as it comes. What if instead of the poetry of repeat, filler and bridge lines, we would just get important lines mixed in with the jokes? Then it would become clear as day that by default the system is clunky and unnatural, stressful and completely unfun, and that the quality of flow, of entertainment, of cohesiveness that makes you feel like of course that's how the dialogues should be, is there exclusively because the developers went out of their way to make something fun out of this clunky system. Something with a sense of pace, something the player will not notice, because if he does, it would mean that they didn't do a perfect job.
I know what you're thinking, Seal. You're thinking, well, all the space and flow stuff is nice and all, but what's the practical point of all this?
Actually, I wasn't even...
Well, to answer your incredibly well-timed question, Seal, we need to follow the instructions of the blind man and talk to the pirate leaders. In their rather humorous exchange, they establish that to become a pirate we must overcome the 3 trials, which prompts us to ask about each trial individually. And in those dialogue options, Seal, we will find the answer to your question.
I did not ask anything.
The sword fighting dialogue option shows an example of how bare bones structure would work. There are 3 lines that merely establish important info without any filler, but then there is an entire line dedicated to a solitary "oh" being said after an awkward pause, with the conversation only then revealing the 4th bit of info, which is then followed up by a repeat, phrased as a joke. You see how, at its core, this dialogue is about 4 bits of information which could be easily said in just 4 lines. However, just by putting filler in between some and making a repeat of them afterwards, something that may seem like useless lines, this dialogue is now interesting to follow. Now look at the idle conversation. You get a bridge first, then 2 bits of info in succession, followed by a repeat of them. Then you get the next important bit that also gets immediately repeated, and the entire dialogue concludes with 2 lines of filler, one of which is a hint and another a joke. This is an interesting dialogue option as it shows how a dialogue can be turned into an entertaining bit, even without filler in between important points. It just says them one after the other, with the breathing room being provided by the repeats. The map dialogue is probably the most interesting one, since after opening up with the bridge, it then throws what can only be described as a fake point. Fake because it doesn't tell you anything new, which is why it feels justified to have the bridge be established by Guybrush himself. He shows agency because he didn't get an answer to his question, which is then followed up by an actual important bit of info in form of a confirmation that there is, in fact, a map. After that you get filler that serves as a build-up to a joke line. Now let's take a step back. Look at how different those dialogues are. Notice how they both look and feel completely unlike each other. Now look at the questions that prompted them. They are exactly the same. How come? Well, this is because at their core, those dialogues we've just praised for variety are also the same. Look at how they would look if we were to cut down all the unnecessary lines. See? Absolutely the same. But notice how now there is something less interesting about them, like their personality and soul has been taken away.
This is precisely why I chose those particular dialogue options, to highlight the significance of structure in dialogues. By all accounts, those 3 should feel repetitive and boring, yet in spite of that, exclusively because of their different formatting, they're a joy to read.
Now imagine if such framework was used for dialogues that are actually different, and you will realize the true value of structure and formatting in dialogues. It gives an already entertaining writing of SoMI another layer of engagement, making the way in which the joke was delivered as important as the joke itself. For instance, As we leave the scum bar, we get a cutscene that introduces the main villain of the game, Ghost Pirate LeChuck, as well as one of my favorite dialogues in the entire game. You see how much character and personality was expressed through not so much what the characters were saying, but how they said it. In a written dialogue, look at how this shipmate desperately tries to deliver important information, how disjointed and unconfident his speech feels due to the formatting of his lines, how they are split apart and filled with literal filler, and compare it to the definitive, complete sentences of LeChuck that exude confidence. But most importantly, notice how they affect one another. LeChuck consistently interrupts the shipmate's struggle to breach his way to the point with lines of complete, irrelevant information, eventually escalating as much as to force the shipmate to drop his speech and entertain LeChuck by engaging with his filler tangent. And notice how, through timing and length of shipmates' lines, through their formatting, you can practically taste the sarcasm of his responses even more than through their actual wording.
Now, if you still think I'm making too big of a deal out of this whole structure thing, just let's see how this dialogue, this very same dialogue, were to play out if a less talented person were to punctuate it.
Do you see how, even though it is literally the same writing, even though from a literary standpoint it is exactly the same dialogue, it feels so horribly different, so utterly worse? It feels as if this entertaining exchange was devoid of life, charm and personality. It now feels stale and dull. Yet the only thing that was changed was the formatting of those lines. Do you now see how much value was added to this game with this meaningful and creative structuring of dialogue? So after the dialogue with the pirate leaders, the game pretty much opens up. You can go to various places and try to solve numerous puzzles. There is a puzzle in the kitchen, the ones at the bridge and at the aisles that prevent you from accessing areas beyond them. There is a shop with items you can buy, motivating you to find some money. The governor's manor that is guarded by piranha-like poodles, some shady looking characters selling some sort of map, as well as the circus with the bizarre Fettuccini brothers. There is a lot to do here, and you can go around doing it in a very open-ended way that only gets more open-ended the further you go, as each of those puzzles open up several new ones. The thing I want you to notice right now is how at pretty much all times you don't have one puzzle to solve, but many.
This branching puzzle solving is essential to adventure games like SoMI, and should I even bother talking about why? Isn't it obvious? I'm joking, of course, let's analyze it.
Are you familiar with the horrifying feeling of being horribly stuck? When you've exhausted every idea you had and now some aggravating puzzle is standing in your way like a brick wall. Well, in short, this is exactly why having multiple puzzles is such a good idea. When there are several puzzles available at once, if you don't know how to solve a particular one, no problem, just go to the next one.
This naturally results in a much more forgiving and fluid gameplay than linear puzzle solving. You only feel legit stuck when you've tried out every puzzle at hand and have spent some time trying to solve each one.
It's basically a way of postponing and minimizing the possibility of the player feeling stuck. But that's not all. In addition to lessening the negative side of puzzle solving, it also increases the positive one, the satisfaction you get from solving it. You know, there is this moment in adventure games when you are just exploring the new locale, find all the new places, characters and puzzles where you can simply collect items and talk to people. Well, with branching puzzle solving, this moment gets extended and prolonged, as since there are multiple puzzles being introduced at once, there is simply more places and screens to explore and interact with. Therefore, you get a pretty good length of this exploratory moment, while in linear games this feeling is almost non-existent, as there are only two states: you are either stuck on a puzzle, or you've solved it and got stuck on the next one.
When there are no multiple puzzles immediately available, there is simply not enough space to explore. Hence, the time in which you just go around and meet the puzzles is practically non-existent.
And this leads us to a fascinating discovery. When you solve a puzzle and uncover several new screens, the time you spend on exploring them is the time you can savor the satisfaction of beating a difficult puzzle. I mean, this feeling is present in linear puzzle solving as well, but you just don't get as much of it, since the puzzle you've solved after so much effort has been replaced almost instantly. There's simply not enough time given to you as a player to let your victory sink in. There can, of course, be other ways of rewarding the player, but with branching puzzles, the process of puzzle solving can be rewarding in itself, especially when you factor in how unlocking a new area can reveal new items which can then be used to solve one of the previously encountered puzzles, creating a chain reaction of solutions that alone increases the rewarding aspect of puzzles by a tenfold. It actually makes the player want to solve a puzzle. And this thing is almost impossible to recreate in linear puzzle solving.
But wait a second, if you only get an item that is required for the current puzzle only after you solve an entirely different one, wouldn't that mean that this puzzle was previously impossible to solve? Well, yeah, it was in fact unsolvable. But that's actually not as bad as it may sound.
Out of the 13 puzzles at the start, you can only solve 7 immediately, meaning that there are 5 puzzles that you are virtually unable to solve. Why would the developers do that? I mean, let's look at the puddles for instance. I'll only be able to deal with them after I solve 2 different puzzles and get their corresponding rewards. So here's the question, why would the developers present a problem with no immediate solution? A problem you'll only be able to solve much later on, now, instead of when the player will have the ability to solve it. To answer that question, let us imagine if there was, in fact, no unsolvable puzzles at the start, and every puzzle would get introduced only after you've solved the ones that give you the necessary items. What would your reaction be if, after you've solved a difficult puzzle, another one were to suddenly appear? I'd wager it would be something along the lines of, another puzzle? For real? Cause remember, every new puzzle is an obstacle that challenges you, that stands in your way. It's a negative feeling, and making a surprise out of it is a sure way to piss the player off. But on the flip side, how have you felt when you suddenly found an item that you could use to solve a puzzle you've encountered 2 to 3 hours ago? Doesn't it feel great to finally deal with something that's been in the back of your mind for all this time?
This is one of the core principles of puzzle solving in SoMI. Every puzzle, no matter how far in the level it will become relevant, is established very early on, so that the surprise of its reveal would be completely removed.
Since you know of a puzzle from the very beginning, when you finally get the item to solve it, it feels pleasant. In other words, by doing this simple trick, the developers make you feel something like you've just discovered a solution to an old problem, rather than uncovering a new problem, which is rather elegant design. The sequence of puzzle solutions would be the same either way, but the experience of play would be profoundly altered for the worse if the developers were to not show you all the puzzles early on. By the way, there is an interesting side effect to having unsolvable puzzles. Since there are multiple puzzles at hand, all of which require items to solve, the amount of items will naturally increase. And if you recall, the main premise of SoMI's gameplay is figuring out which items go in which puzzles. Now, check this out. Because of unsolvable puzzles, in addition to not knowing what puzzle the item is for, you now get a question of when the item will become useful. The item might be for a puzzle you haven't even seen yet, and the one you just picked up might be used immediately. And the opposite is also true. Even though you have dozens of items, you might not have the one needed for the current situation. Or you might have had it for the entire game, you never know. You see how, just by itself, this mechanic detrivializes puzzle solving. Without multiple puzzles, with some being currently unsolvable, the developers would have to come up with some contrived ways of making the player think, like punishing the incorrect solution or including tons of useless items. Yet now, with the resulting numerous and dispersed throughout the game items, this problem solves itself. Not only do you not know whether the item you've just found is appropriate for the current situation, but there is simply a bigger volume of them in your inventory, making brute force approach into appropriately the weapon of last resort. Just look at the store, for instance, with all the items that tempt you by being inaccessible until you find some money, aka solve a different puzzle that will unlock them. How much less interesting the game would be if you were to just stumble upon those items, instead of seeing them all the time on a store counter and wanting to get the ability to buy them. How much less satisfying would their acquisition be without all this build-up? But I digress. To illustrate how this unlocking of puzzles thing works, let us go to the circus. A puzzle that serves as a catalyst to many others.
Okay, so let me be honest right now. The conversation we are about to enter is crucial to our analysis, because it will highlight possibly the most important thing about the dialogues of this game. But for now, I'll just let the scene speak for itself.
Now, I know that on a person watching a recorded video, this scene won't have anywhere near as much of an effect as it does on the person playing a game. But, and allow me to break the illusion a little here, so much has happened within those 15 seconds of dialogue that it took me 4 pages of edited text to properly pin down all of it. Let's get the obvious out of the way first. The entire gag of the scene is the classic comedy trope of having the protagonist be caught in between two extremely fast-spoken individuals. This gag is so old, it was probably one of the very first jokes to be played on stage. We've all seen it a million times, but what I find interesting is the way it was presented through the limited technology of what is now a 30-year-old engine. Notice how, due to the inability to see Guybrush's eyes, or any of his facial features for that matter, developers had to signify who he is looking at by him literally turning his head 180 degrees in the direction of the person he is looking at. It would be close to impossible to depict the scene if they were to be placed in any other way. Furthermore, as the onslaught of words continues, it becomes difficult for him to keep up with it, which is reflected in his head turning, losing its precision, becoming seemingly randomized, and I mean, this is funny. And not because of the primitive fast-talking siblings gimmick, but because of how cleverly it was presented through the pixel art technology of the early 90s. The ingenuity with which the developers found a way to express this gag without any actors' faces, even without any voices, is creative to say the least. Because of that voiceless pixel art presentation, this age-old gag feels novel.
And by the way, voiceless. If I were to tell you that I was about to make a joke about how fast people are talking, and that I was going to do it through just text, more than that, text without any descriptions, that I was just about to put lines of dialogue on screen and that's it, you'd probably think I was mad, but here it is.
Somehow the developers managed to do just that, and they did it so seamlessly. When you saw the scene, you probably didn't even notice how paradoxical their achievement was. I know I didn't. It seems so natural that when I first played this game, I took it for granted, which is something the developers have to be commended for. They achieve the impossible and make it seem effortless. But how exactly did they do it? Over the course of the game, up to this point, text was used exclusively to convey dialogue, which is by now something you get used to. As a player, this is your expectation now. When you initiate conversation with a character, letters above his head represent his speech. So seeing as the text appears at a certain speed, within this context of having text be representing the character's speech, we begin to associate the speed with the speed with which the character is speaking. It's basically the same as when we see an arrangement of pixels and can understand what it represents, even though it barely resembles a human being. Our imagination does half the job. So, seeing as now, after an hour or so of play, we got used to a certain speed of text, when suddenly it starts appearing at several times the normal speed, what results can only be described as subversion of the player's expectation. You simply don't expect it. And the brilliant part of it all is that due to the described context of those lines, due to what you began to associate this text with, you feel as if you're caught in between two fast-talking siblings, whose onslaught of words is so hard to follow you miss half of what they're saying, simply because the lines begin to appear on screen at a slightly different speed. By the way, notice how I use the word miss when describing a text-driven conversation, what is ostensibly a literary work, a screenplay, and it actually made sense. Can you imagine reading a book or a comic and saying something like this? I missed this line, I didn't read this line, I skipped this line. Well, yeah, it usually happens when you don't really want to read, so you decide to skip on content due to your lack of interest. It is something the writer doesn't want you to do, as the story would fall apart if you suddenly decided to skip most of what he tells you about the events. For example, how else would you know that the protagonist has been cut off in the middle of his speech without ellipses at the end of a sentence? Or how would you know that he doesn't really care for what the other person is saying without another description of his waning interest? If you skip lines while reading, you might skip the very description that tells you of how the protagonist would have skipped the lines if he could. Now look at SoMI. I'm not ashamed to admit that when I first played this game, I missed almost all of what they were saying because their speech was just so fast. It was very hard to follow. You see what happens? What I've just described sounds like something the protagonist of a story would say to himself, something the writer would comment upon in another description I experienced firsthand. Let me say it straight, I didn't read the lines in a text-driven story, and the very fact of me missing them conveyed just as much information about the scene as the text itself. It meant something. I missed out on content and it actually enhanced the story, because now I, the player, felt something that the protagonist should feel in this situation.
By missing out on lines, I felt overwhelmed, confused, put on the spot, even annoyed. All those emotions the protagonist of the story should feel in this scene, and I felt them. Somehow the game managed to translate all those feelings to the player through the mere manipulation of its text.
But this is just one example of how this game manipulates text to create genuine emotional responses out of the player. Not with the text itself, but through the context it appears in. I mean, within this very scene, when we first entered the circus, remember how the brothers kept on talking in the upper left side of the screen, while we had to choose the dialogue options on the bottom? You know what that means, right? The player had to consciously choose to ignore the text in a text-driven game. Notice how previously we were unintentionally missing lines, but here you have to actively choose not to read something, even though text is literally your eyes and ears in this situation. And it wasn't like the game told you to do it. It was something you did organically, entirely on your own, as if you are actually the protagonist of this story who himself decided not to pay attention to what these people are saying. And that's not even the extent of it all. Honestly, this scene is incredible when you start to take it apart. There is a little detail that is virtually impossible to notice on a video exactly because it relies on the player having built certain expectations from having played SoMI for a while now. But first let me ask you, Have you noticed how Guybrush always repeats the dialogue option after you chose it? It almost feels unnecessary. Player obviously has read the line, so why should he read it again? Well, because the line-by-line mechanism of SoMI's dialogue is akin to a marathon in which the player has to keep up his speed of reading disappearing lines. So what this initial startup in form of a repeat line does is it allows the player to calmly adjust to the speed. This is why it feels so jarring when this adjusting period is cut off when the brothers interrupt Guybrush's line. Because of the subversion of expectations, you feel cut off yourself without any ellipses. Just because your typical reading routine was interrupted, you feel interrupted. And once again, the ways developers achieve it is so brilliantly simple. They merely halve the time Guybrush's line remain on screen, as well as made a visual gag of brothers running up to him to give it context. Such a simple thing, yet the result is the player feels genuinely caught off guard, like he was actually interrupted. And this same creativity, just maybe not as packed as it is in the circus, is present throughout the majority of SoMI's dialogues. It's basically magic. I honestly don't know how else to describe it. The developers not only knew the value of making the text dynamic, but knew how to use this dynamic format as a tool to spark those genuine feelings in the player. I mean, you see it, right? It works, and it works perfectly. As you play, the illusion of dialogue is so strong, it actually makes me happy that devs didn't have the ability to go the easy route and simply voice act everything. This ingenuity of using subversion of expectations to spark emotions that within the context of the scene and the established mechanics become reflective of what you and the character you play as are supposed to feel in the scene is incredible to experience.
This is the brilliance of SoMI. The fact that it goes a step beyond what is expected of it. It tries to basically achieve something that shouldn't be possible with such primitive technology. And yet, somehow, the developers managed to achieve this with such finesse and elegance. It looks easy.
What we are really looking at right now is a game design at its finest, a work that uses sensibilities that are exclusive to gaming as an art form, a work that only becomes great the moment it comes in contact with the human player, as if the last bit of compiling of its code, the very thing that will make it into something timeless, occurs not on screen but within the player's mind. And this is not compounded to just dialogues, as the developers found a way to elevate the seemingly plain gameplay of point-and-click puzzle solving in just as powerful a fashion as they did the written dialogues. You see, when I think of SoMI's puzzles, the first word that comes to my mind is variety. Didn't expect that, did you? But it's true. Every other puzzle introduces a new gimmick, like following the map instructions to get through the woods, which differs from simply use zing on zing formula quite a bit. Or the exact opposite of when you fall down in water and become restrained in movements until you figure out how to free yourself. And compare it to getting mugs of grog to a prisoner as they melt, which is the only puzzle in the game with a timed element to it. Or getting the red herring by standing in a specific spot rather than using any item or command.
I obviously won't go through all of them, but you get the idea. It seems like within the boundaries of point-and-click adventure gameplay, the developers tried to get as much variety as they could. But if I had to pick my favorite puzzle, it would most definitely be the sword fighting.
You don't need to be a genius game designer to see that creating a token combat system in a point-and-click adventure game is a recipe for disaster, especially when you are making it for a little action minigame. So instead of making an inevitably clunky and unfun minigame, developers decided to turn... Jesus, Seal, you're gonna hate me for this. They decided to turn swordplay into wordplay.
For crying out loud.
Okay, so the main gimmick here is You know how in movies, when characters fight, they sometimes accompany their battles with witty banter? Well, here it's more like the battle is accompanying the banter, since the victor is the one with the cleverest comebacks. One will attack the other with an offensive statement to which the defender has to come up with a response. And if he does, he will be the one attacking on the next round. What's important, however, is that Guybrush is the cleverest git, who won't think of anything witty to save his life. But he does have an outstanding memory. What follows is a continuous learning process as you try to memorize as many offensive and defensive lines as you can. And as a mechanic, this is good enough, but what truly steals the show is when you confront the Swordmaster. You see, with random pirates, you only have to memorize which comebacks to use against which statements. And since you were doing it for a long enough time, it sort of became an automatic, reflexive action. You don't even read the line anymore, you just choose the appropriate response. So imagine the surprise when you discover that her offenses are completely different from the ones you were used to. And this is not even the best part. Even though her lines are different, your comebacks are still appropriate. It's just that now, instead of mechanically selecting the correct answer, you actually have to be clever and choose the one line that would make perfect sense within the given context. And this is perfect. I mean, what we are seeing right now is actually how you should be making comedy puzzles. You actually solve it by being funny. Those banters were humorous before, but now, seeing all those comebacks recontextualized so severely without changing a solitary word adds another dimension to their humorous value. The original implications of each of those responses were so engraved into your mind after all those battles that using them now with actual thought involved and in a totally different context really makes for one hell of a comedic gameplay.
I mean, imagine if there was no grind and you would just be thrown into a Swordmaster duel with all the comebacks given to you off the bat. Well, it would be exactly the same duel, right? Well, it wouldn't be nearly as enjoyable. Why is that? Well, there's an actual reason for this. And I'm going to explain this to you.
There is no need to point out how clever some of those exchanges are, so seeing those clever comebacks, and I mean not even variations of them, but those exact lines being used in a completely different context with an equal level of wit is not just a testament to their writing, but to me at least, something rather eye-opening. How can someone with a list of written down comebacks seem so unquestionably clever? It is by definition a farce, and that's the key here. It adds another layer to this already funny joke. On top of exchanges being humorous on their own, on top of seeing comebacks being cleverly recontextualized, making them even funnier, there is a paradoxical sight of a man with a bunch of notes and not a single original thought in his head becoming a champion of witty wordplay. And this man is controlled by you. If video games have potential as a medium for comedic art, this is it. It's a joke that literally wouldn't work in any other medium, which, in addition to being funny, highlights the paradoxical nature of human wit.
You know, Seal, for the first time in my life, I feel like I finally did justice to LucasArts. Like, I don't know. Like I was able to express something I always thought was indescribable. But anyway.
George, where are you going?
What do you mean where I'm going? I'm supposed to open the window right now.
George, according to the script, you should do it only after the second world building segment. The one in which you talk about how this game maintains continuity in its fourth wall breaking sequences and stuff.
I forgot about that. Just give me a second.
This is your script. How could you forget?
I know, it's embarrassing, but just give me a second. I'll find the right part.
For the first time, I feel like I did justice to LucasArts. For crying out loud, who writes stupid lines like this?
Sorry, were you saying something, Seal? I'm afraid I was distracted.
Oh, nothing important. Just thinking out loud.
Oh, there it is.
What also caught me off guard is the amount of attention to detail in this game. For instance, remember how we could use the info we got from the dog to get ahead in the story? Well, the devs could easily just say that this dog talk didn't count and totally get away with it, simply because it would fit the non-serious parody vibe of the game. Like, they could say it was a joke and nothing more. But as we've established, devs didn't choose this approach as an excuse to be lazy, but the exact opposite, which is why they still went the extra mile and thought of letting the player use the info he got out of a fourth wall breaking joke. Why? Because the player and Guybrush knows the name LeChuck now, so it wouldn't make sense if they wouldn't be able to ask about it. This is actually a bit weird how it works. How the developers try to maintain realism and continuity in a game so content on being non-authentic and random. The dog speaking out the name LeChuck is random and funny, but the fact that Guybrush remembers that name is a sign of continuity. And it's even funnier because of that. Just imagine how Guybrush would have to explain where he heard this name. The extra touches don't end there, there is a ton of them in this game. Like the posters that you can look at, and depending at which point in the narrative you do so, you get a different description. Furthermore, depending on what order you complete puzzles and interact with certain characters, their dialogues can change rather drastically. Sometimes even leading to an entirely different scenes. For example, if you decide to finish the idol trial last, instead of a bridge love scene with Elaine, you get this one. Granted, it's not as funny in my opinion, but hey, developers actually went ahead and made an entirely new scene just to maintain continuity. I mean, they could have easily just chip out and just use the love scene regardless, and no one playing this silly game would question it, even though it wouldn't make sense within the narrative. And this is the question, why do they care so much for continuity when SoMI itself breaks its own believability with fourth wall breaking sequences and NPCs speaking out of character? What is the point of keeping tabs on its own self-ridicule? If I had to compare SoMI to anything in terms of its tone, it would be parodies, like Naked Gun or Airplane. But those were exactly that, parodies. They took cliches and common tropes of certain genres and made fun of them.
Bingo.
But what is SoMI a parody of? You could say it's a parody of pirate stereotypes, but in reality there are hardly any jokes on that topic. The majority of this game's humor comes from making fun of its dialogue system and gameplay mechanics, jokes that play around with the UI conventions and recurring elements that can be observed in point-and-click adventure games of the 90s, specifically those of LucasArts variety. I mean, the subversive gameplay humor of SoMI would be most resonating with people that have played Full Throttle, Day of the Tentacles, The Dig, Broken Sword, 7 Max, The Loom, you know, LucasArts type of adventure games, so if anything it would be a parody of those titles. But SoMI came out before all of them. In fact, SoMI was the game that established the conventions of a point-and-click game it so gleefully mocks. I mean, dialogue trees were rarely seen in adventure games up to this point. Only after SoMI, dialogue trees became widespread. SoMI was the pioneer of that. And yet, I can't think of any games that would use dialogue trees more creatively than SoMI does. Another game that would be so on point with the subversion of expectations within its dialogue. But it doesn't make any sense. SoMI made those expectations. It parodies something it itself invented. Something that would become common because of SoMI. I honestly have no idea how to even call that. It's like this game came from the future or something, and
It's a self-parody.
Wait, what?
You seem to have trouble explaining what SoMI is trying to be, so here you go. This game makes fun of its own content, it's a parody of itself. Self-parody. Do you even know what self-parody is?
Right, the window scene.
Who do I have to work with?
So now we are on a boat, and let's be honest, this is the weakest part of SoMI. I mean, it has some neat moments in it, including what is by far my favorite joke in the entire game, but there is no arguing that part 2 is but a small bridge between the brilliant first and the even more brilliant third parts. So my advice is to just not dwell too long in this segment. If you do find yourself stuck, you should totally go ahead and use an FAQ. I mean, SoMI is already that rare adventure game that wouldn't be ruined in any way if you were to look up solutions online. I know I shouldn't be saying stuff like that without elaborating, but this video is already way longer than it has any right to be, and quite frankly I don't think SoMI is the right game to be discussing that topic. For now, let's just say using a guide in adventure games is harmful because it damages your immersion in the world of the game. And since SoMI rejects the very idea of immersion with its philosophy of world breaking, the experience wouldn't be altered in any way if you were to look up solutions online. But getting back on topic, let me just say that the entire game was pretty much building towards the explosions that is part 3, so what you want is to get through part 2 as fast as you can and...
What's the matter?
I have to admit, Seal, I've never had as much trouble in analysis as I have now with SoMI. It's like I keep digging deeper and deeper, and yet I still can't reach the core of what defines this game.
I don't know, George, it seemed to me you were doing just fine.
I'm glad you say that, but it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel complete. Here's the thing.
Usually there is a distinct, dominant aspect to any game. It can be engaging gameplay, story, or strong world building with immersive atmosphere. None of those are dominant in SoMI. The story is merely there, the world building feels more like world breaking, and even the gameplay seems to be supplementary to something else. And I'm not quite sure I see that something.
You know, I think for the first time I'll actually ask for your help, Seal. I mean, after all this time we simply can't turn our backs now. We have to get to the bottom of this, you know?
Alright then.
Well,
I was hoping you'd at least try to guess or something, but whatever. The point is that right now you should be asking 2 questions. First, what is the ultimate point of making multiple puzzle system, and how it affects the experience at the most visceral level? Second, you should try to understand what lies at the core of this dialogue format, beyond the structure and beyond the subversion of expectations. If you answer those two questions, George, you'll figure out the secret of Monkey Island.
What a horrible pun, Seal. Jesus.
Okay, let's try the dialogues first. At its core, the dialogue in SoMI is a series of lines appearing on screen, right? So, in fact, you could easily convert this into a screenplay of sorts, and it even sounds like a solid idea since all the text would be immediately available and the player would be free to read it at his leisure. He might skip to a further moment in a conversation or go back to a previous line to refresh his memory. This idea is not even that far-fetched. The readers have experienced this for hundreds of years in form of plays. However, what the developers did altered this familiar experience beyond recognition. They split the dialogues into lines, sometimes splitting even the lines themselves, delivering them sequentially, without giving access to any line prior or after the one that is shown to the player right now. In other words, the player only has access to a solitary line that is on screen at this very moment. Everything else is currently non-existent. The only bit of agency on the reader's part in the system is to jump to the next line. Unlike how in literary dramatic screenplays you have access to all the previous and future lines. There you choose to follow the dialogue line to line, but here you are forced to. This actually sounds a lot like the dialogue from something like Final Fantasy, in which the line is always waiting for the player until he presses a button to skip it. A mechanic that allows for a much more complicated vocabulary than the one in SoMI to be used much more liberally. Notice by the way how the name of the character is established before each line, which is another similarity to plays. SoMI on the other hand relies on colors and visual cues to signify the person speaking, meaning that there are fewer words on screen and thus the lines become easier to read and read quickly, which is important since here the dialogues are timed. This is the key difference that makes SoMI's format both better and worse than the one in Final Fantasy, which is more suited for slow, thoughtful, literary dialogue. Also, in exchange for emotional and thematic depth, SoMI allows the creative freedom to make the context of the dialogue just as entertaining as its content. I mean, you've already seen how much value SoMI manages to get out of it. How it manages to strike emotion through the way lines appear on screen. This is something impossible within the format of Final Fantasy, which in comparison to life and energy of SoMI's, well, granted much simpler dialogue, feels like a static book.
George, it feels like you're treading the same grounds again.
I know, just give me a minute. I'm building to something here.
Okay, I'm waiting.
What's important is that no matter how you treat this dialogue system, no matter how you customize and approach it, no matter how used you get to it, there will still be this fact of line-to-line jumping, and that alone makes a profound difference.
But let's look at this dialogue system from another angle. Obviously, the devs could choose any lengths to attribute to those solitary lines. They could just dump the entire speech of the character in one go if they wanted to, with the dialogues then becoming just compounded speeches appearing one after the other, again like in screenplays. But why didn't they? I think a good way to illustrate this would be a comparison to a game that fully embraces and actively pursues literary sensibilities, Planescape Torment, whose dialogue is to Final Fantasy like what Final Fantasy was to SoMI. You see, it actually does dump entire paragraphs of text on you as the responses of the people you are talking with, as well as descriptions of their appearances and gestures. Naturally, putting time limit over such long and complicated text would be ludicrous. In fact, Planescape couldn't be further from what we have in SoMI, as it allows you to access all the previous responses, resulting in an experience as similar to reading a book as you can get in a video game. As I've said, the inherent gimmick of literature is that it makes the entire text available for you at all times, allowing you to freely jump around on a whim from previous to next line while keeping the entire structure of the dialogue in your mind with such ease. It takes virtually no effort, even though there are dozens of words immediately available. I think that simply viewing those approaches to constructing written dialogues side by side is already enough to highlight the uniqueness and creativity exhibited in SoMI's format. But up to this point, we've been analyzing it from the literary end of the spectrum, yet as we all know, devs strive for cinematic, so it wouldn't make sense not to examine SoMI from that end as well. But first, imagine if you address all that amount of mental processing power, that universal quality all human beings capable of reading have, to a solitary line of 10 or so words. No matter how slow or inexperienced a reader you are, you will gulp it down.
Now, I don't mean that you actually have to read the line fast. As I've said, the speed of dialogue is adjustable, so everyone will be comfortable with different speeds, taking different amount of time to read the lines. But no matter how fast or slow you actually read them, the simple fact of there being one small line on screen will make you feel like you read it fast.
Just compare it to audio dialogue. With that, you take the line one word at a time, and once the word is spoken, it's gone. Here, the words don't matter as much, as they stay permanently as long as the line is on screen. The line, and not the word, becomes an entity that you need to comprehend to follow the conversation along.
Maybe I'm overcomplicating a simple thing here, but trust me, I'm not here to do any sort of psychologically complex analysis of how brain absorbs information. I'm just trying to highlight the difference between conventional methods of dialogue structure and the one implemented in this type of games.
It just feels like you absorb information not one word at a time, but one line at a time. I think it would become clear with this experiment. Just first watch a movie dialogue scene, normally, and then try watching the film muted with subtitles. Even though the content and context is exactly the same, the difference in sensibility, the way it feels, is gigantic. Now, I don't know exactly how the devs figured out the subtlety, but they did. It's very evident that the construction of dialogues in this game is hyper aware of that sensibility. Some lines get emphasized, some get gulped down like fill of words, some are delivered calmly, some emotional with exclamation marks, some feel quiet and some feel loud with capitalized words. Even without taking into account the elaborate scenes like the circus one, for instance, it somehow manages to feel cinematic and energetic, like a movie scene, even though it is literally just text. So what I hope I managed to illustrate well enough with all those comparisons is that even though SoMI uses movie and literary dialogues as stepping stones, what it ultimately creates is a sensibility completely unlike either of them. Reading through Final Fantasy or Planescape's conversations feels like a choose-your-own-adventure book, and voice-acted dialogues from later adventure games feel distinctly like cartoons with subtitles. But SoMI doesn't really feel like anything. It's something completely unique, something exclusive to video games and early point-and-click adventure games specifically.
What SoMI invented is basically a new medium of storytelling. And I know I'm exaggerating at this point, but this exaggeration is the only way I can properly highlight the significance, the underappreciated significance of SoMI's discovery. It is literally a new form of dialogue construction, with its own rules and even creative possibilities.
Granted, it's not as versatile as the ones it inspires by, but still, it has its own artistic merit. And it allows to create something not feasible in any other format, like the dog conversation, for instance, that got horrendously butchered in the voice-acted remake of this game. Or even better than that, just remember how the age-old comedy tropes got new life by simply being expressed through this format. If that doesn't speak volume for the uniqueness of this dialogue system, I don't know what will.
So here it is. By pursuing cinematic ideals with literary tools, developers unknowingly discovered a new storytelling sensibility. And thankfully, as you've been able to observe over the course of this video, they've been able to capitalize upon it, creating what is essentially a one-of-a-kind experience. There. Now I feel like we've got the dialogues down, Seal.
Yeah, but there is still gameplay to cover.
I'm on it, Seal.
So the idea is that when you have several puzzles to solve at once, there is a higher possibility that you'll figure out a solution to at least one of them than when you have to solve just one specific puzzle. It's really a matter of probability. Puzzle solving is, bottom line, all about the player trying out different solutions until he stumbles upon the correct one. And whether the correct solution will come to his mind is basically a matter of luck more than anything. So having several puzzles to experiment with simply increases the probability of finding the right solution for at least one of them. And when...
Sorry to interrupt, but you are not on the right track right now.
What do you mean? Am I saying something incorrect or...
No, it's just not something at all important right now. Maybe you should try again.
Okay, let's try this again.
You know how they always say, if you're stuck or don't know how to solve a particular problem, like in a math homework for instance, take a break, distract yourself for a while and then come back to it. And that way you can actually find the solution much faster. Well, that is another reason why having multiple puzzles is a good thing, as when you stop thinking about a specific problem at hand and think about something else, you distract yourself from the first one. Stop thinking about it. And so when you later come back to it, there is a higher probability that you'll solve it than when you have to continuously beat your head over it, without any breaks or distractions. And increasing the probability of the player solving the puzzle is always a good thing, as in this lies the core enjoyment of puzzle solving. Furthermore, it's just easier on the brain. When there are multiple puzzles, it feels less stressful than when you have to solve just one. You feel like you can sort of go easy on them. Sure, you didn't solve one, but you can go try the others. It's just more enjoyable that way.
That's not it either.
Damn it, Seal. Can you just give me a hint or something?
Okay, look. All this time you've been pointing out how branching puzzles make the game more forgiving, rewarding, less stressful, and less aggravating. How it foreshadows some puzzles and stuff.
Yeah, so?
Don't you think it's all just various manifestations of the game being less rigid in terms of structure and more in tune with the player? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I see what you mean. I didn't think of approaching it from that angle. But let's do it.
Turns out, at least according to this silly seal over here, that the most essential implication of branching puzzles is in how they manage to add a sense of pace and flow to the puzzle solving gameplay, making the experience much more organic and fluid. Let me elaborate. Instead of being in a state of either stuck or, let's call it, solved state, the jump between which occurs with a practically audible click, there is now a much more gradual transition between the two. Let's say you reach the next part of SoMI. You start exploring the new locations, collecting items, looking at objects, talking with characters, and interacting with environments. And the more you explore, the more you understand the layout of the place, as well as the amount and nature of its puzzles. Needless to say that the player at this point feels anything but stuck. So when you're done exploring, you start walking around and experimenting, trying out various items on all those various puzzles. Maybe you even find a solution for one of them right off the bat, so you never even come close to the stuck state. But if not, you keep on experimenting until you retrace your steps and try out less obvious objects and actions. Maybe you find some hidden items that you previously missed. In this case, even though you were a little stuck, you didn't really feel all that aggravated. Finally, if you can't find any of the solutions after all those steps, only then do you feel legit stuck. Let me repeat that. You feel stuck only after all those steps. Just notice how many stages of puzzle interaction have transpired, as well as how many possibilities was there to never even reach the stuck state. Just as a comparison, let's look at the progression of a linear game. You see the puzzle, try to solve it. If you do, you'll enter the next level. If not, you get stuck. Sounds much less elegant, doesn't it?
As you can tell, with branching puzzles, the dreaded stuck state becomes much more distant in terms of gameplay progression, as well as less disarming by itself, which obviously leads to a much less stressful puzzle-solving experience.
It's all a matter of pacing. It feels pleasant to make progress and overcome obstacles, and it feels bad to become stuck and unable to do anything. And due to the inherent nature of adventure games, their gameplay will gravitate towards this negative feeling unless the player solves something. The game by default wants you to feel happy, so it extends the exploratory moment as much as it can by having multiple puzzles, numerous dialogues, tons of items to find and places to explore. And yes, the more you explore, the closer you get to the dreaded stuck state on the graph of gameplay pacing. But every time you solve anything, this gradual decline gets reset back to the positive end. In the system, the downgrade to the stuck state occurs immensely slow, yet every positive accomplishment boosts the pacing up to the solved state immensely fast, thus ensuring that overall the experience is satisfying. Furthermore, in case of Monkey Island specifically, developers make the reward for solving each puzzle distinct enough to further increase this positive feeling, so that even if the player reaches this stuck state, it would feel justified, since the more difficulty you had in solving a puzzle, the more satisfying it is to finally solve it. And let's not forget that since there are several puzzles available at once, the mere chance of stumbling upon at least one solution is increased. And just one solution, one bit of progress is enough to completely reset the whole system and completely negate the feeling of being stuck. So what branching multiple puzzles do is improve the core enjoyment of puzzle solving with a sense of pacing. It decreases the speed at which you reach the legit stuck state, while at the same time increasing the chances of you solving something. And then it preserves the satisfaction of the solution for as long as it possibly can, even though it's still a matter of chance as to whether your experience of playing SoMI will be positive or frustrating. The probability of it being a positive one is now as high as it could possibly be without sacrificing what makes puzzles fun in the first place, their challenge.
Now I don't think we can get any deeper than that without just becoming totally silly in the process. But there is no need for that anyway, because at this point, we can already see the whole picture of SoMI pretty clearly.
We now know that at their core, the fundamentals of SoMI have immense potential. The dialogue format creates unique storytelling sensibility that is exclusive to games as an art form, and the branching puzzle-solving system that maximizes what makes puzzles fun in the first place. So what the developers did was take advantage of those sound fundamentals by creating a set of structural rules that are aimed at making this new dialogue sensibility approachable and easy to get into. And the same with puzzles, as the developers carefully orchestrate the gameplay system by making most puzzles accessible at the start of the level, long before they become solvable, thus reinforcing multiple puzzle design with a sense of build-up, and even stronger sense of pacing. And as if that's not enough, the developers went even further by allowing themselves to bend and break those structural rules at precisely the right moments to use the subversion of expectations to bring a level of humanity and unpredictability to the dialogues and spark genuine emotional responses from the player. And in a similar fashion, they put a cherry on top of the gameplay system by bringing variety into the mix. As pretty much every big puzzle introduces a unique twist on the point-and-click puzzle-solving formula, it's like the developers went out of their way to maximize the entertainment value of every bit of SoMI's code. The scary thing, however, is that this tower of layers is not the end. It's not even close. We haven't even added the self-aware humor that is prevalent in every aspect of this game. Humor that brings an entire new life to every single one of those layers. There are jokes made at the expense of those complicated gameplay and dialogue systems that point out how even with all of their complexity, they are still a part of a primitive game made with primitive technology. Jokes at the expense of the user interface, pixelated graphics, the lack of voice acting, even at the expense of the player himself. And we haven't even mentioned the fourth wall breaking continuity of this game, which makes the entire experience feel not so much like a pirate-themed adventure, but as a bad theater play about pirates, in which the actors consistently speak out of character, in which you can easily spot set pieces that don't even belong in the setting, and the set itself feels like it's going to fall apart at any minute. It's like the developers themselves couldn't keep a straight face while programming this game, so they decided to just have fun with it, which should be a bad thing, but somehow it manages to give this game a parody, self-aware edge that further elevates this game into the realm of timelessness. It is everything an adventure game from the 1990s could be and more. It is a game that defies expectations, and the older it gets, the more shocking it becomes to the newcomers that simply don't expect the definitive, classic point-and-click adventure to be so meta, to be so effective at subversion of expectations, that basically plays the player like a violin, effortlessly sparking genuine emotional responses that games nowadays struggle to master even with their multi-million-dollar budgets and the entire history of game design behind their backs. To play SoMI now is to remind yourself of what masterful games actually feel like, and what they're not just capable of achieving as an art form, but what they have already perfected. Because as it is now, SoMI is by far the funniest and most entertaining comedy game I've ever played. And granted, things like immersion, meaningful storytelling, and character development had to be sacrificed to achieve this level of pure entertainment, but that is the core of SoMI's timelessness. It is humble enough to not pretend to be anything but an entertaining game. Yet the extreme lengths it goes towards in becoming as entertaining as it can possibly be is admirable, to say the least.
Now I honestly don't know how to concisely summarize why this game is so timelessly enjoyable. I guess it's simply a matter of every single element within the package that is called Secret of Monkey Island working together in such tight unison towards entertaining the person behind the monitor. Simply the idea of changing a single thing within it sounds like blasphemy.
If even one aspect of this game would be slightly altered, the entire magic of its artistic accomplishment would be gone. As you can see from the special edition re-release, which is a fine game in its own right, but it's not SoMI. SoMI needs those pixelated graphics, it needs to be voiceless, it needs to have this exact gameplay system and this exact interface, otherwise the entire pyramid of its design would fall apart. Literally everything I've been saying over the course of the last hour is inapplicable to the special edition because, quite frankly, you can't make anything more special than the original Monkey Island.
SoMI is one of those games that simply doesn't seem to age, and I can guarantee that it will be played and appreciated no matter how many dozens of years pass since its original release. Because The Secret of Monkey Island is, without a doubt, a great game. Oh, that took way longer than I anticipated. In every sense of the word.
Well, I just hope the viewers have learned their lesson for today.
Which is?
Never spend more than 25 minutes on a video game review.
Cut. That's it. That's enough for today.